Good evening to everyone and welcome to this historical discussion of AIIMS May paper. First I need to thank all my students of Berhampur in Orissa, the Kurnool, Vizag and Warangal students who immediately after the entrance recalled all the 4 options of 200 questions and facts to me, so that it is possible that in such an early time we are able to host this discussion. It is also historical because today we discuss here, tomorrow at 250 locations in 120 cities in the country. It is visible on the Reliance web world anywhere. So thanks also goes to the technology. So we need not wait that by tomorrow evening the student in Kashmir to Kanyakumari can be able to go through the discussion that we are having today. So let us start today's discussion, Doctor. Vision 2020. The right to sight does not include what? Basically the Vision 2020 is a initiative done by the World Health Organization in order to take care of all possible avoidable blindnesses. Causes of the blindnesses need to be taken care. So cataract is the biggest cause of the blindness worldwide. So the Vision 2020 basically takes care of it. Trachoma is another important major cause of the blindness. And what is that strategy called as, Doctor? SAFE. So basically it is the surgery, antibiotics, facial cleanliness and environmental changes is basically the one which is initiated. Even onchocerciasis is also included as a part of Vision 2020, especially in African countries, and childhood blindness and low vision, which is the problem in around 124 million people across the world, also need to be taken care, is what the objective said. So onchocerciasis, trachoma, cataract, all the 3 are being taken care is what need to be fundamentally remembered. Where does the common carotid artery bifurcates? This is a common question we had been discussing in anatomy. There are totally 12 vessels in our body. Invariably one question comes whether you take All India or AIIMS on one of these 12 vessels, aorta's branches and also the vertebrobasilar system you need to be doubly sure about. So at the level of the 4th cervical vertebra, the common carotid artery basically bifurcates. That is, we are talking in relation to the posterior aspect. How about the anterior aspect? What is the relationship? So now the next important thing is there is something called carotid triangle which we need to know. Basically carotid triangle is a part of the anterior triangle of the neck. So it has got certain boundaries where behind you have sternocleidomastoid, below there is a superior belly of the omohyoid and above there is a stylohyoideus and the posterior belly of the digastricus, where it is basically called the carotid triangle, through which the carotid artery basically will be passing. Now in the upper part of the common carotid artery basically bifurcates at the level of the upper border of the thyroid cartilage into external and internal carotid. So finally at the level of the vertebra, that is the 4th cervical vertebra, anteriorly in relationship to the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, the common carotid bifurcation happens is what you need to fundamentally remember. What is the most common ectopic site for the pancreas? Stomach is the most common site. Even the small bowel, Meckel's diverticulum, gallbladder and spleen are the other important locations is what need to be remembered. Now anywhere along the foregut until the point of proximal midgut there can be a distribution of the ectopic pancreas is what I want to underscore to all of you. So classically if you do the endoscopy, some of you are going to be the best DM gastroenterology within a short period of time. So there can be in the pre-pyloric area of the stomach the presence of an ectopic pancreas like this is what you need to fundamentally understand. Now I will give you a short case study in order to make what we are learning, if possible we need to look at it more practically, then we will remember in a longer way. So a 30-year-old man has presented with a right lower quadrant pain. When contrast enhanced CT had been taken, it is very simple, it is an abdominal CT, there is a vertebra, here you have the kidney, and here you are able to find the presence of the ascending colon, and this is the area where typically the Meckel's diverticulum is located, and within the Meckel's diverticulum there is an ectopic pancreas. So that is the reason one of the sites for the ectopic pancreas can even be Meckel's diverticulum is what you need to fundamentally understand. But the most common site is undoubtedly the stomach, the prepyloric area is what I like to emphasize once more. Aldosterone receptors, where do you come across? It's very simple. In the vasculature we have the aldosterone receptors, in the kidney we have it, but there are certain atypical locations in addition to that also we need to remember. Basically the mineralocorticoid receptors are found in the cytoplasm and nucleus. The apical membrane of the epithelial cells of the distal convoluted tubule is the location where the mineralocorticoid receptors are located. And wherever there is a need for the conservation of the salt in our body, in all those organ systems we have the mineralocorticoid receptors. So that is the reason in the colon, the sweat glands, the lung, and also in the tongue we come across the presence of the mineralocorticoid receptors. To which important subfamily does this belong to, doctor? It's called the nuclear receptor superfamily, to which it basically belongs to. And the purpose of the mineralocorticoid receptors is in order to make a unidirectional transport transepithelially of the sodium is the main purpose of the mineralocorticoid receptor. Now what happens if there is an activation of the mineralocorticoid receptors in the non-epithelial tissues? That's very important aspect. Number one, the hypertrophy and fibrosis of the heart that we come across, one of the concepts is it is all because of excessive mineralocorticoid stimulation, mineralocorticoid receptor stimulation on the heart. That's the reason, though the main purpose of the mineralocorticoid receptors is to make the sodium to pass unidirectionally, it also has an implication in the pathogenesis of the hypertrophic cardiac disease also, is what you need to basically remember. So that is the reason that drugs like ACE inhibitors are known to be very protective, especially those who have a hypertensive heart disease, in preventing the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So the main reason is typically the mineralocorticoids are also implicated in the hypertrophy of the heart, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now coming to the brain, it is in the hippocampus where we find the highest concentration of the mineralocorticoid receptors, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now if you carefully look at the past 3 to 4 years of the question papers of All India and AIIMS, doctor, lot of issues come on this very important aspect called HSP, heat shock protein. We need to be doubly sure about. Even this question, that is a mineralocorticoid receptor, is also a part of that super topic called heat shock proteins. We need to be doubly sure. Few topics are so abstract that at least we should act that we know about them. So at least in the entrance we can make a reasonable guess. So now also even the aldosterone receptor, it has got a very close relationship with a complex of heat shock proteins called HSP 90, 70 and 50. Once the aldosterone binds, there is a receptor ligand complex which become created. It translocates to the nucleus. There it attaches to what is called as the hormone responsive element, and there it will cause the transcription rate to become elevated, and that is how the mineralocorticoid basically act at the level of the nuclear level with the help of heat shock protein are the important buzzwords that what need to be basically remembered. Now let us talk about the liver. We have a wonderful complement system which helps our immunity. Which components of the complement system are synthesized in the liver is a very important question, which is a frequently asked question. The C2, C3, C4 and the factor B of the complement system are the ones, their motherland lies with the liver, is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. A 9-month pregnant lady presents with the jaundice. This is a common question that we often discuss in our Sunday test papers. As a physician, you will be called for examining a pregnant lady who is having jaundice. What is the most common cause of jaundice in pregnancy, whether pregnant or non-pregnant, doctor? Any day it is the viral hepatitis which is the most common cause, whether pregnant or non-pregnant. So a 9-month pregnant lady presents with the jaundice with the distension of the pedal, the abdominal distension and pedal edema, and her bilirubin is around 5 and serum alkaline phosphatase is elevated, and ascitic fluid analysis when done is showing the presence of albumin of 3 grams per deciliter, then what is the possible diagnosis in this given scenario? If there is a viral hepatitis, do you come across a right ventricular failure and a congestive heart failure, doctor? We don't come across. Viral hepatitis really do not cause. So we must seek for some condition which causes a liver dysfunction in the form of jaundice. At the same time also leads to development of the right ventricular failure with the pedal edema like presentation. Can you tell me what can be such a common condition with both involvement of the heart failure and also the liver failure? So liver failure must be something a vascular in cause, so that can be responsible. So Budd-Chiari syndrome is a hepatic vein thrombosis, and because of the hepatic vein thrombosis there is a right ventricular failure because the veins, the lower body veins are not able to drain into the heart because the hepatic vein which is bridging inferior vena cava is totally blocked because of this thrombosis. Hence there is a presence of the pedal edema, etc., etc. At the same time, because there is a hepatic vein thrombosis is there and involvement of liver is there, there is a development of jaundice is what you need to fundamentally understand. Now the question is, for the Budd-Chiari syndrome and hepatic vein thrombosis, is the pregnancy is a risk factor, is my question to all of you. There are certain set of conditions which are called the prothrombotic states which we need to remember. So any case of rapid development of abdominal pain, ascites, hepatomegaly, jaundice and renal failure should make us to contemplate of the possibility of this condition called as the Budd-Chiari syndrome. Patient will have icterus, ascites, hepatosplenomegaly, ankle edema, etc., etc. Now what are those prothrombotic conditions which can precipitate this hepatic vein thrombosis? Polycythemia rubra vera, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria is also a prothrombotic state is what we need to remember. Any myeloproliferative disorder, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome in SLE patients, let us say. Similarly, protein C, protein S deficiency, antithrombin 3 deficiency, factor 5 Leiden deficiency, etc., etc. They are all called as the prothrombotic states is what I want to underscore to all of you. Similarly, the presence of pregnancy itself is a risk factor as a prothrombotic state. Similarly, there can be a membranous web which is there within the inferior vena cava, and certain chronic infections in the liver like the hydatid cyst, aspergillosis, amoebic abscess and tuberculosis also can precipitate a prothrombotic state and a Budd-Chiari syndrome. And similarly, Behçet syndrome, SLE, etc. So the list is very long, but at least we need to remember pregnancy and an underlying internal malignancy like a myeloproliferative state, they are the important risk factors for Budd-Chiari is what need to be fundamentally remembered. So what happens in Budd-Chiari syndrome, doctor? There is a hepatic vein thrombosis. Basically liver receives the blood from the portal vein, and from the liver the blood will leave in the form of hepatic vein, drains into inferior vena cava, drains into the right side of the heart. Now if there is any blockage of this hepatic vein, what will happen? Collaterals will develop. So typically all this excessive collateralization of the veins will create this kind of appearance if you happen to do the hepatic vein angiography in Budd-Chiari. What is it called as? Spider web-like appearance on the hepatic venous angiography is considered to be pathognomonic feature radiologically for the Budd-Chiari is what you need to fundamentally remember. Now in a case of Budd-Chiari syndrome who has ascites and right ventricular failure, if you do ascitic fluid analysis, what is going to be the classical findings? They have a high protein concentration in the ascitic fluid, greater than 2. WBC count is going to be less because it is not infective ascites. And serum ascites albumin gradient is usually less than 1.1 is the classical features of the ascitic fluid analysis in Budd-Chiari syndrome is what need to be remembered. From which part of the gut the iron is commonly absorbed? Fundamental question. Whether you go to DM gastroenterology entrance also, you will get the same question. So now let us talk about it. The iron absorption predominantly happens in the duodenum and the upper jejunum is what need to be remembered. Now what happens to the iron in the stomach is my question to all of you. Typically the iron is reduced to iron 2 form from iron 3 form, Fe+3 to Fe+2. It all courtesy goes to the gastric low pH is what need to be remembered. Then once it enters into the duodenum which is alkaline rich, in this alkaline rich environment basically this Fe+2 form is the one by which it will be basically be absorbed into. So the bioavailability, if you basically look for the iron, which is the most bioavailable form of iron, doctor? Heme. Then it is Fe+2 form, then Fe+3 form. So it need to convert from +3 to +2 form. That is what happens in the case of the stomach. Now a lot of questions come on inhibitors of iron absorption and stimulants of iron absorption need to be doubly sure about. phytates, tannins, starch, iron overload, antacids, they are all the predominant inhibitors. So your patient who had a gastric ulcer, who became addict for the antacids, is a very important candidate. You need to look for the possible iron deficiency anemia clinically. Now the lead, cobalt, strontium, manganese and zinc are the competitors. Ascorbate, citrate, amino acids and iron deficiency are the facilitators for the iron reabsorption. Absorption from the gut is what need to be remembered. Now let us go to the next question. This is another standard question. There are totally around 11 cycles in the whole of the biochemistry. So how many minutes of time we require before entrance to revise biochemistry? Not 11 days. It should not be more than 11 minutes, at most 11 hours. So that should be the speed in the last moment that you need to revise. So which part of the cycle happens in cytoplasm? Basically glycolysis occurs in the eukaryotic cells which don't have even mitochondria, like the erythrocytes, and similarly those under low oxygen conditions when we are exercising also without any requirement of mitochondria it happens, hence it happens in cytosol, is what need to be basically remembered. Now this is a very interesting question. What is our Murphy's law for preparation for entrance? Common sense law. Without a question on leukemia and lymphoma, there is no question paper. In this paper itself of AIIMS, if you examine, there were 4 questions on vitamins. I think examiner is obsessed about vitamins. Which vitamin falls into the urine, which vitamin is required for certain biochemical reaction. At the end of our discussion you will recognize. So like that, there are some of the very crucial topics. Let us talk about the leukemia. Acute promyelocytic leukemia. Why do you want to remember about it, doctor? Disseminated intravascular coagulation is one of the important causes which can lead to the development of mortality. That's the reason we need to be doubly sure about everything about acute promyelocytic variant of leukemia, M3 type. Now if you look at acute promyelocytic leukemia, it differs from any other forms of acute myeloid leukemia. What is the main reason? Those patients of acute promyelocytic variant of AML, they are generally younger. They often present with pancytopenia rather than with leukocytosis as a presentation. They are the 2 things by which you can recognize the APML variant. By the time you are in MD third year, if the patient is diagnosed with AML, just based on the age and the complete picture showing the pancytopenia only, you will be thinking maybe the biopsy report will come as APML after doing bone marrow biopsy. So 2 important things: younger patients. Number 2, the presence of pancytopenia instead of leukocytosis makes the APML, the leukemia, apart from the other classes of AML is what need to be remembered. In fact, this rule of thumb is so important and consistent that if at all in any case of leukemia, if at all the WBC count is more than 5,000, you need to suspect ever the possibility of APML is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. And also APML is notorious because of the disseminated intravascular coagulation. If you are in MD general medicine, the moment APML patient walks to you, you must give a red alert to your blood bank people. I require at least 50 packets of WBC, RBC and platelets. That must be the level of preparedness the moment APML patient walks into your intensive care is what need to be remembered. Now there are 2 important things from the cytogenetics point of view which signify the prognosis in a patient of APML. One is the presence of the translocation 1517, other is the PML RARA rearrangement. Why these things are very important? If these 2 cytogenetic abnormalities are there, such patients more likely to respond to the therapy with retinoic acid is what I want to underscore to all of you. The all-trans retinoic acid is a very important part of the treatment. Generally leukemias, that to myeloid leukemias, means they carry a bad prognosis because most of the chemotherapeutic agents, they do not respond. But the good news about the APML, acute promyelocytic leukemia, what you can tell your patient is, sir, there is a wonderful treatment called retinoic acid, simple vitamin A, which is available for taking care of your bigger condition called as APML. But you have initiated the retinoic acid treatment. What will happen to your patient on the day 2 or day 3 of his admission under your care? Suddenly he will develop dyspnea. You must be prepared for this. Why? Once you give retinoic acid, once there is a differentiation of the cells, what happens is these differentiating lymphoid cells will go into the pulmonary capillaries, they will clog the pulmonary capillaries, and suddenly ARDS like presentation with dyspnea, suddenly patient worsens. Nothing to worry, you need to simply stabilize the patient who is presenting with sudden dyspnea after initiating retinoic acid therapy. What is that called as, doctor? It's called the retinoic acid syndrome, where the differentiation of the leukemic promyelocytic cells into the polynuclear cells will make the patient to develop fever, weight gain, pericardial effusion, respiratory distress, but it is only fatal in 9% of cases only, is what need to be remembered. So currently the most standard treatment protocol for a patient of acute promyelocytic leukemia is the combination of this ATRA, retinoic acid, and the anthracycline based chemotherapy is what I want to underscore. And the maintenance therapy for the APML includes 3 drugs: methotrexate, the mercaptopurine and methotrexate, and the ATRA. These 3 things are the ones which are commonly used. Now there is a lot of development in the APML research. They found that arsenic trioxide is a wonderful agent which also is highly active. It can be able to induce the clinical remission in about 85% of patients who are having the APML. But the problem is, even arsenic trioxide if you use, it can cause this APL differentiation syndrome. The moment the cells which are de-differentiated start differentiating after starting arsenic trioxide, patient will develop similar fever, weight gain, pleural effusion with respiratory distress, just like the retinoic acid syndrome. In spite of that, it is still considered that the arsenic trioxide is a wonderful drug for the APML. And finally, you also need to plan for an autologous stem cell transplantation as a wonderful therapeutic option for your patient who is having APML. So finally, you need to be doubly sure, doctor, arsenic is a wonderful drug which can be used for the APML, is what need to be basically remembered. Now let us go to the next question. AST by ALT ratio is a very important ratio in the liver function test, which will give you a wonderful clue as to what is the underlying etiology for the cirrhosis of the patient. A high AST by ALT ratio indicates that this cirrhosis of the patient is because of the advanced alcoholic liver disease, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Naturally, you will ask me a question, that means early phase of the alcoholic liver disease, will the AST by ALT ratio will not be greater than 1? Definitely not. In fact, it is a very important clue even to prognosticate the severity of the liver disease, which is alcoholic liver disease. Also AST by ALT can help you. If at all the AST by ALT ratio is less than 1, such a patient of alcoholic liver disease has got a better prognosis, is what I want to underscore to all of you. Then another important reason we need to remember is, in the case of the NASH, there is a very important entity called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. The middle-aged females or males who are not alcoholic in nature also, if ultrasound done, ultrasound may show the presence of a coarse ecotexture suggestive of fatty liver. So what is that entity called? Non-alcoholic steatohepatitis is an important form of fatty liver which is seen in the non-alcoholic obese individuals in their mid-40s, is what you have to be doubly sure about. Now in the case of the NASH people, how will be the AST by ALT ratio if you happen to do the LFT? Even in them the mean value will be around 1.4, greater than 1. One more entity, Wilson's disease, if it leads to liver involvement, also will lead to the AST by ALT greater than 1. In fact, the mean value can be 4.5. So to summarize, doctor, the AST ALT greater than 1 is seen with the NASH, with the Wilson's, and also with the severe form of the alcoholic hepatitis, is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. We'll take up this question a little later. A patient has got chronic diarrhea, a very standard clinical vignette which is frequently tested in the entrance. He also has anemia with the raised liver enzymes. How do we correlate all the 3? Definitely it is not a liver disease. It must be some systemic disease with a varied manifestations. Especially as a physician, you must be doubly sure. Is it an organ localized disease entity or is it a systemic disease? You need to be doubly sure about. So celiac sprue is a condition where you find malabsorption, and a garden variety of clinical features where there will be chronic diarrhea, steatorrhea, flatulence, weight loss, fatigue, anemia, bleeding diathesis. Osteopenia also can occur with the celiac sprue because of the vitamin D malabsorption, and the seizures can happen and there can be a stunted growth. Out of all this, in celiac sprue, diarrhea is considered to be, a relentless diarrhea is considered to be the most common symptom. Why does anemia occur in a case of celiac sprue? Because of the deficiency of iron, folate and rarely vitamin B12, and there can even be a low serum iron level classically in the case of the celiac sprue is what I want to underscore. Now how do you diagnose celiac sprue? It is the immunoglobulin G and the immunoglobulin A which are important. Immunoglobulin A, anti-tissue transglutaminase it's called as, is the one which will help you to diagnose the celiac sprue. And there is also an IgA antibody against the endomysium which also is helpful for you to make the diagnosis. In fact, for prognosis also it is important. The moment you start treating a case of celiac sprue, the anti-endomysial IgA antibody levels are expected to come down the moment you initiated a gluten-free diet in a patient with celiac sprue is what I want to underscore to all of you. So there is a reason. What is your answer, doctor? It is the anti-endomysial antibody which is important. Can you tell me where is anti-mitochondrial antibody important? Another case of jaundice, pruritus, primary biliary cirrhosis. In a middle-aged female, pruritus, jaundice with raised alkaline phosphatase, you should suspect possibility of the primary biliary cirrhosis. There the anti-mitochondrial antibody is important is what I want to underscore. Invariably questions come on these topics of the serology in rheumatology, doctor. You need to be doubly sure in SLE, etc., etc. Now let's go to the next question. A survey is done to study the effect of the dose of insulin and the corresponding HbA1c levels. Now what is the best test that you want to choose in order to bring a valid conclusion of your observations? There is something called linear regression, logistic regression, Pearson coefficient. Once more, statistics is one subject. At least we need to act that we know it, whether we know or not, because to become a good statistician it is a lifetime achievement. I mean, even in the graveyard the soul will be heaving that, oh, some concept is missing, kind of feeling you get, especially in topics like abstract statistics, etc. So at least for entrance, let us not do research on statistics. Working knowledge is what we will try to acquire. Linear regression means what? Very simple, doctor. There is something called an independent variable on which one dependent variable will be there. If you eat more, you will become fat. So which is the dependent variable? Becoming fat. Independent variable is eating, because there are independently so many reasons where we can become fat, right? So basically linear regression gives a relationship between one dependent and one independent variable, and that is the reason here also a linear regression can take care. Then why do we require logistic regression is my question to all of you. Now we are studying the relationship between two variables. Variables are of two types. What are they? Yes or no type of variables. Are you a male or female? They can only be yes or no, which is a discrete variable. Height, weight, etc., whose mean value can be calculated. What are they called as? Continuous variables. Suppose if both the variables are discrete or continuous, no problem, we can carry on a linear regression. But suppose if one variable is discrete, other variable is a continuous variable, then in that case we can't be able to use a model like linear regression. There we have to use a model like logistic regression is what I want to underscore to all of you. So basically logistic regression allows us to predict a discrete outcome from a set of variables, and that set of variables from which outcome is coming can be a discrete variable, continuous variable, or anything. But the outcome is basically a discrete outcome, yes or no type of outcome, whereas the independent variable is a discrete, continuous, or whatever it is. So in such a scenario we need to basically use the logistic regression. In this case, do you think that the insulin dose and the level of HbA1c, either of them, are they, any of these two are discrete? They are not discrete, they both are continuous basically. So that is the reason we don't require a logistic regression here. We are sufficiently happy with the linear regression itself is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. Now the next important question is Pearson's coefficient. Where do we use this? Actually the full name of it is Pearson's correlation coefficient. When there are two variables, if one variable is increasing, other is decreasing, it's called negative correlation. One is slightly increasing, other is strongly decreasing, then it is basically a strong regression. So basically this correlation and regression basically uses the trend line between one and the other variable. For that you require the Pearson's correlation coefficient, not for this scenario, is what I want to once more underscore. So let us go to the next question. What is the difference in the purine metabolism in the birds and the human beings is my question to all of you. Now what is the final product of the purine metabolism in birds versus that of the human beings? Allantoin is the product of oxidation of the uric acid by the purine catabolism in the case of the lower animals, that is the non-primates, is what need to be remembered. Luckily human beings are happy with only uric acid level only. Now let us talk about the Korsakoff sounds blood pressure assessment fundamental question, clinical question. So basically what should be the ratio between the thickness of the arm of your patient and the what you call the BP cuff diameter, and of course your energy levels to tie it. So generally what happens is VIP syndrome will be there. He is the home minister and you need to tie the BP cuff and then do. So you don't know, if you tie too tight, that fellow will say, what is this? Put this fellow inside. So if you tie too loose also, you will not get the value. So sometimes VIP syndromes happen. Sometimes post duty we will be not having energy. For a case of only a little formality we will be checking BPs. So in all that scenario, basically a good BP tying, cuff tying is important, doctor. We conducted one workshop for all our nurses. So at least they will have energy in tying the cuff. So you need to be doubly sure that the blood pressure cuff to that of the arm circumference ratio should be 0.4 optimally, 40% it should be. If it is a small cuff, it will give a spuriously high BP is what you need to fundamentally remember. So depending on the arm circumference, if it is 34 centimeters arm circumference, at least it must be a 13-inch cuff is what need to be remembered. So also different values had been given. How many of you had aortic regurgitation as your exam case? Generally in aortic regurgitation what you need to do? Of course in every case you are expected to do. What is that? Upper arm BP and lower leg BP also. Thigh BP you have to check. Generally what is the common mistake we do? Same cuff which we use for the arm also we will be using even for the thigh also. So do you think that there is a right way? It's not right way actually. A small cuff will cause a spuriously high BP unless that ratio between circumference of the limb and the circumference of the BP cuff is well maintained at 40%. Now coming to Korsakoff sounds, the first sound is basically the systolic BP, third and fourth sounds are basically at pressures within 10 millimeters above the value of the diastolic, and fifth is the point which is below the diastolic blood pressure, as all of you know very well. Have you recorded diastolic BP of 0? Quite common in wide pulse pressure if it is there. In aortic regurgitation like conditions, the lower value will not come, is what need to be remembered. Now let's go to the next question. 21-year-old individual has got anemia with hepatosplenomegaly with a history of single blood transfusion. What is your possible diagnosis? Very simple, doctor. You have three types of thalassemia. Thalassemia minor, major and intermediate. Minor means he neither requires transfusions nor he has got any hepatosplenomegaly. Then what does he has got? If you do complete blood picture, he will have microcytic hypochromic anemia, that's all. If it is a thalassemia major, recurrent history of transfusions will be there. Then intermediate means he will have organomegaly but not such a recurrent requirement of transfusion. Such a person is graded as thalassemia intermediate is what need to be remembered. Why do we have this spectrum, doctor? We have this spectrum basically because there is a heterozygous state, homozygous state. Accordingly we have got this wide spectrum is what need to be basically remembered. Now once more another common Murphy's law without a question on one of the CD markers. So at least copy it in a CD and go to the exam hall or store it in your pen drive and recall in the exam. Whatever you do, you need to remember some CD. Do you think To become a good MD, do we require to remember CDs? Not really required, but for screening and entrance, definitely it is required. So there is a small list. Every day morning, while you are on jog, you need to remember and recall it, or while going to a coffee in the middle of your preparation. CD1A is found in the Langerhans cells, CD2 is in the T cells, NK cells and LAK cells. CD3, CD4 are also once more T cell markers. CD8 is for the cytotoxic T cells. CD10 is a marker for the ALL, and the CD14 is a macrophage marker. 15 and 30 are the Hodgkin's lymphoma, like that, etc., etc. Lot of list is there, which you also can read in any standard book. Not required to basically take point. But what is important is CD5 is important T cell marker, CD19 is a B cell marker. When do you suspect a given lymphoid tissue that it is a malignant tissue? Instead of expressing only B or T, if it is expressing both of them, like a CD5 of the T cell and CD19 of the B cell, both of them, if it is expressing, it is more likely to be a malignant lymphocyte, is what I want to underscore to all of you. So out of all this, CD5 is a marker which is a T cell marker. I am not very sure which numbers he has given in. 24 was there. Let us check what is 24 is basically in this. Of course 24 is not there in any of this list. We will check that. What is this 24 also? Alright. Vitamin is excreted, which is excreted in the urine. All of you know it is the vitamin C. If you write more B complex tablets, what will happen? Patient will excrete in urine, and finally Hussain Sagar has such a wonderful scent is because credit goes to Association of Physicians of Hyderabad for everything multivitamin, unless then patient is also not happy about it. So that is the main reason it is lost into urine like vitamin C. It is not stored in the body is what need to be remembered. A 2-year-old child on 8th day of receiving the Cefaclor has presented with fever, malaise, lymphadenopathy and a pruritic rash on the body. First of all, it is not Kawasaki disease, which is a mucocutaneous lymphadenitis. From day 1 only it will be there, from the day of fever. It won't be like after by about 8th day appearing is not the likelihood. Now the challenge is between infectious mononucleosis and drug reaction. How many answered infectious mononucleosis in the actual exam? Generally the story is, in infectious mononucleosis, how will patient present? With exudative pharyngitis because of the Epstein-Barr virus infection. Kissing disease is otherwise called as. And unknowingly you have written amoxicillin to the patient. Immediately after receiving ampicillin, patient develops a rash. So lymphadenopathy he has got, sore throat he has got because of the actual disease, rash he got because of your amoxicillin. But their rash will not wait for 8 days and appear. Immediately it will appear. Once more, patient received Cefaclor. There is no such story like Cefaclor also causes rash in the infectious mononucleosis. Is it true? No. Only amoxicillin is implicated as a notorious drug to cause that, not the Cefaclor, at least in the literature search. Now let us talk about Cefaclor. Cefaclor can cause a drug reaction? It can cause. Now the question is, if that is so, why did it not cause on the day 1 itself? Why did it cause on the day 8 is important. There are 2 types of drug reactions, early onset, delayed onset. Now the question is, why there is a lymphadenopathy then? Lymphadenopathy cannot be explained by a drug reaction. It can be explained. There is one of the types of drug reaction called serum sickness can be one of the forms of drug reaction. In that case, there is appearance of lymphadenopathy. So we need to finally remember, doctor, serum sickness is a type 3 hypersensitivity reaction, which is because the immune complex deposition, and typically it occurs in the drugs like Cefaclor, where there is a direct toxicity on the cells by the metabolites of the Cefaclor, and it presents with fever, rash, arthritis, arthralgia and even lymphadenopathy also can be a presentation of a delayed drug reaction of the Cefaclor, which is of the serum sickness type of drug reaction, is what I want to once more underscore to all of you. Now tell me, doctor, what are all the other drugs which also are capable of causing serum sickness like illness? Very common in our practice is the streptokinase. While you are injecting, you must be doubly sure about. Recently patient had an upper respiratory tract infection, you must be careful in delivering the streptokinase. Similarly, already he received streptokinase, once more if you give streptokinase also this kind of reaction can appear. Similarly, antibiotics like cephalosporins, ciprofloxacin, grisofulvin, sulfonamides, tetracyclines, metronidazole also can lead to the development of serum sickness type of delayed drug reaction is what I want to underscore to all of you.